my situation is
Once again, thank you very much. Both very special songs. And now I would like to call upon Dr. Hensom to introduce our keynote speaker, Susan Armsten. Dr. Hensom.
I'm delighted to welcome a fellow person from Saskatchewan. I didn't know that until I looked at Susan's CV and found out that she attended Evan Hardy Collegiate in Saskatoon, and was a grade 12 honors student from that high school. Went on to a Bachelor of Journalism and took honors at Carleton University in Ottawa. From that time on, she went on into the media field. She began in 1979 as a TV and radio reporter in Saskatoon, and then I realized how important it is in Canada to be able to speak in 2 languages, and so took a French immersion course in 1980. In 1981, she went into the CBC training program, and from there on has been associated with the CBC in one way or another in various places, beginning in Ottawa as a reporter on Newsline and Nightline, and then moving to Toronto in the NewsHour and the News Final. She's had many, many interesting assignments. I'm not going to try to tell you all of them, but I think that you will soon learn that her work has taken her as a reporter and as an on-air broadcaster right through all of the experiences one associates with the glamour of being on the Journal and on the national network. At the same time, we're looking forward to hearing Susan talk about what it means to be a woman in the media, one of the major cultural influences in our society today. Will you welcome with me, Susan Armsten.
I'm not sure what it means to have 2 prairie girls talking at you today, but I hope we've had some effect. I didn't know either that Dr. Hensom had spent some time in the West, as Mary said, and it feels good to have somebody from your hometown around, let me tell you. You've chosen an apt title, I think, for your rally, Women, the Choices We Make, and I've made an important choice to come here and speak to you today. My option was to go to my regular aerobics class at the YW. So if in about 15 minutes I start panting and pumping my arms, you'll know that my body is telling me I need exercise. Yesterday I had an interesting experience, and I thought it was a forewarning of what I was going to be speaking about today. I came in from the airport and for the first time got a woman taxi driver. Now that's not so significant or novel. What was novel was that tucked behind her seats for me to read in the back were women's magazines, the kind of thing that you just love to read if you're tired after a voyage. Not the mind-bending or mind-stretching type of magazines, you know, Mademoiselle, Cosmopolitan, Ms., Chatelaine, Glamour, but perfect for that ride back from the airport. And when I asked her about the women's magazine, she said, well, I did get one complaint once. She said, a man got into my taxi cab and said, why don't you have men's magazines in your cab? And she said, well, when's the last time you read a women's magazine? Maybe you'd learn something. And that ended that. So what's a TV anchor woman doing talking to a women's rally, you might ask? You know, we're just the voices behind the teeth and the hair. You know, a silk blouse, a smart suit, an attractive brooch, and voila, an anchor woman, a Twinkie. Thankfully, those images of women in television news and current affairs are fading, and none too soon. The beauty queens who stepped out of their minks and gowns on the stage and into the interview set, talking to world leaders, have in many cases failed. They've been replaced by women with expertise, experience, professionalism, women who have something to contribute, women who have demanded top roles in the media and have landed them on their merit. The media, and television in particular, has been listening to women's demands to see themselves reflected. There's evidence at the CBC, for instance, that we've been forced through public or political pressure to re-examine the CBC's inequalities. In the early 1980s, for instance, CBC conducted a survey on sex role stereotyping in CBC broadcasting. And the results, I believe, are encouraging. On the national news in 1981, only 8% of the reporters were women. In 1984, there were double that number of women reporting on the National. The National has responded since that time by hiring more women in key places, in areas that were previously dominated by men. Today, there is a woman foreign correspondent working for the National. There is finally a woman reporting from Parliament Hill. There are legal, economic, science, and medicine specialists reporting for the National, all of them women. On the Journal, of course, the host is a woman, and there are a great number of female correspondents. In Halifax, I think we have a unique example of progress. On the program that I front, First Edition, there's myself and Jim Nunn. There is a female sportscaster and a female weatherwoman. However, on the darker side of things, the media has a ways to go. Putting women in front of the camera simply will not do. The true test of employment equity is to take a hard look at the traditional areas, job ghettos, women in areas like support staff, secretaries, clerks, receptionists. At present, the CBC is conducting an inventory of its staff across the country in response to the government's demands for employment equity plans. And the results of that study will produce a fairer look at how the CBC is doing in equality. In private broadcasting, the gains, I'm afraid, come slower. While we're arguing in the legislatures of this country about equal pay for work of equal value, I've been told that female broadcasters in this city are being paid less than their male counterparts for doing essentially the same work. I thought we had already won that battle. The visible changes towards equality for women working in the media have come largely in response to your demands for more role models. Women tired of being characterized on soaps as jealous divorcees have demanded more accurate representation of themselves in the mass media, and it's working. However, now that we've come this far, taken women out of the kitchen in every ad and sitcom that we see and onto TV in responsible roles, we run the risk of stopping there, far short of equality. Now our challenge is to tackle the more subtle forms of discrimination in the media, the inbred biases which continue to affect the way we see ourselves and the way other people see us. The media has tremendous influence. More people get their news from television than any other medium. The media, like it or not, decides the issues of the day. And if you don't believe that, just think of the uproar among politicians in Ottawa recently about the media's agenda, the complaints about taking off and complaining about the government day in and day out. Transport Minister John Crosbie said we were scum. I guess we should have ignored him when he called Sheila Cox a titmouse or baby. I always say that you could judge the weight of your actions by the reaction that they cause. The media focuses people's attention on what it decides is newsworthy. The media is a reflection of society, but it's reflected through a filter. The media decide what will be reflected back to you and what it decides will be filtered out. The media create charismatic figures and tear them down. It sets up role models and ridicules others. What the media report, how they report it, who they choose to tell the stories has an enormous impact on how we view the world. And it will influence in a significant way what the men and women of the future think about and how they act. If, as is the case now, mostly men comment on the significant legal, political, and economic events of the day, then women's opinions will be questioned. If, in the CBC survey, for instance, between 1980 and 1984, only 5% of the experts interviewed, that's 1 in 20, were women, that's appalling. And it doesn't even come close to reflecting our society. Women are more likely to be interviewed as observers of events than as commentators or experts on those events. If we allow that to continue, we deny ourselves our share of the limelight, not to mention demeaning our own intellects. If we in the media lead you through stories about Cisco and cod and tourists and seals and the falling dollar and the rising unemployment before we get to the stories about daycare and pay equity, then we assure women that the issues that affect them are less important. We reinforce it. If we interview women only on wife battery, birth control, or wage parity, then we reserve a space for them, guaranteed, on the life pages of the newspapers or in the softer, later part of a TV newscast. If we continue to crown older men on the news with authority, trustworthiness, and appeal, despite their gray hair, but we yank their female peers off the air because their faces too show some character, then we put unfair pressure and anxiety on women to hurry up, make their mark, get their pension in, because their days are numbered. This isn't rhetoric, it happens. Jan Tennant, a respected Toronto anchorwoman in her late 40s, was once asked into her employer's office, and her boss said, "Jan, we've been having a few complaints. Are you going to color your hair?" And Jan, true to her spirit, said, "Not on your life, not until Peter Truman uses loving care too." That ended that discussion. Jan is something of a pioneer in television. She was the first female anchor on CBC Network News, but she was relegated to the weekend and backup anchor jobs. Jan used to say that she'd read the news when the boys went golfing. She left CBC before equality in television became politically palatable, and she's now retiring from a spot on Global TV. CTV's excellent female anchorwoman, Sandy Ronaldo, also reads the weekend news and backs up a male anchor, Lloyd Robertson. We in the media must take responsibility to work at these inequalities within. But you, on the outside, looking in, must demand better treatment and lobby for it. And that brings me to an idea which I feel strongly about and want to pass on to you today. I'm suggesting a challenge to you on this International Women's Day. If you accept that the media has tremendous influence, then why not use that to influence and educate others about what you believe is important? You, the potential newsmakers of the future, and us, the news reporters, have different roles to play, but we can share the goal of women's rights and equality. And if we share that goal and respect each other's roles, we will go farther, faster than we could ever go alone. If unnecessary adversarial lines are drawn between us, the news reporters, and you, the newsmakers, less will be accomplished. I'm not promoting propaganda on the 6 o'clock news. The CBC would be on my case were I to do that. I'm not even suggesting a practice which isn't being followed in other areas. Take politics, for example. Journalists help create successful politicians. They create backroom boys, rainmakers, miracle workers. In return, they get better stories. I'm not suggesting anything the less for us. It's a finely tuned system in the old voice network. Why not in our network? I'm not even advocating anything truly modern. There is a long and fruitful history of women journalists devoting themselves and their craft to the advancement of women. On the prairies, for example, close to my heart, many of the leaders of the suffragette movement in the early 1900s were newspaper women. People such as Frances Bainan, editor of the Country Homemakers page in the Grain Grower's Guide. Her sister Lillian Bainan Thomas wrote for the Winnipeg Free Press. Violet McNaughton, a Saskatchewan suffragette, wrote a column mainly for women in the Western Producer. And Nellie McClung, a prolific writer for the Free Press, the Calgary Herald, and truly a women's activist on the prairies. These women provoked the debate about the role of women on the pages of farm weeklies and on newspapers. They wrote unfalteringly for the improvement of women's wages and for greater opportunities and for the vote. They antagonized and challenged men and women on the prairies to rethink their roles. They created news and then they wrote about it. They were women who fully understood the power of the press and they pushed it to its limits. Take a moment to listen to this account from Nellie McClung's autobiography of one of the ways they created news that they wanted published. As members of the Canadian Press Women's Club, or as their critics called it, the Cats with Pointed Claws Club, they wanted to improve the dreadful plight of women workers in small factories, long hours, paltry wages, and distressing working conditions. This excerpt from her autobiography. Mrs. Claude Nash and I were set out to bring pressure to bear on the government for the appointment of a woman factory inspector. We decided to go see Sir Rodman Roblin, the Premier, and if possible, convince him to come with us to see some of those factories. We conducted the Premier down dark, slippery stairs to an airless basement where light in midday came from gaunt light bulbs hanging from smoky ceilings. The floor was littered with the refuse of apple peelings and discarded clothing. There was no ventilation. We led the Premier through a side door into a foul passage where a queue had formed in front of a room marked toilet. We could see that Sir Rodman was deeply shocked that we should know about such things, but Mrs. Nash led the way and I pushed him along from behind. We drew attention to the fact that there were no separate accommodations for the women, and we did not need to remind him that the plumbing had evidently gone wrong. We knew he was soon going to bolt away from us, so we didn't spare him anything. "For God's sakes, get me out of here," he cried at last. "I'm choking. I never knew such hellholes existed." "These people work from 8:30 to 6 o'clock, Sir Rodman, 6 days a week," Mrs. Nash said sweetly. "But no doubt they get used to it." I'm afraid her sarcasm was lost on Sir Rodman. With this understanding, he bolted and we parted. Although this excerpt is taken from Nellie McClung's autobiography, I'm convinced that she probably wrote about this in some of the popular press at the time. The tradition of women's activists, feminists writing in the popular press has continued to this day. I think of contemporary columnists that I read, June Colwood in the Globe and Mail, or Michelle Landsberg in the Toronto Star, numerous others in various publications. And this relationship I'm suggesting is not an easy one because journalists have a role to play. We're constantly under pressure and are hypersensitive these days about fairness and balance because we are under fire from those who say that we're lefties and socialists. Broadcasting in the United States particularly has been marked with this tune, and it has to have an effect on the product. But it's not impossible, this relationship. It seems as if women's issues these days are more complex than in Nellie McClung's time, although I'm sure she would argue with me there. Now when we talk about daycare, homemakers lash out, demanding that their side be told, rightly so. Now when the government funds the National Action Committee on the status of women and we write about it, real women demand equal funding and equal time. Women's issues are maturing, growing out of simplistic adolescence. They've become more difficult to explain. There is more gray, less black and white. But this relationship between women in the media and outside the media can work, and it can produce satisfying results. A practical example. Last year, the Ontario government was considering legislating equal pay for work of equal value, one of the most controversial issues in labour at the moment. There were committees after committees, there were 3 months of public hearings, everybody had their say, there were business lobbies, there were women's lobbies, there were labor lobbies. I was dispatched to do a story on pay equity, as they called it, and its success rested on one thing: my ability to find a man and find a woman who worked in the same place where I could compare their salaries, to explain the issue, which is the most difficult part. If it sounds simple, believe me, it's not. Pay equity actually exists in many companies, but it's so politically hot right now that many companies don't want to admit that they're even following it. I was desperate. After days of research, my deadline was approaching. I had turned up no candidates for my story, and the group that finally came through to help me was the Equal Pay Coalition in Toronto, a highly dedicated and effective group of women who were conducting a lobby for equal pay. They found me a perfect example. A head secretary who ran an elementary school outside of Toronto. She did the clerical work, she did the banking, and all kinds of odds and sods. She had all kinds of education and skills. The comparison was with a senior caretaker, a job requiring less education and less skills. He made $1 more an hour than she did. That's more than $1,500 more a year. The story that I eventually produced was successful because I was able to point to real people who were facing a situation where equal pay for work of equal value could improve their conditions. The Equal Pay Coalition, on their part, got their message across. They got further debate and explanation of their issue. And I might say that after that story aired on television, the Attorney General of Ontario used my example, our example, to back up some of his arguments that pay equity was necessary. And I just relate that to show to you the practical ways when you go out from here and are working in various areas. If you ever need to get your issue across, get debate on your issue, these are some of the ways that you can do it. These are the ways that you and us can work together